I welcome you all to the module 3. Module 3 is about sensation and perception, and this is lecture number 5, overall lecture number 5, but this is the first lecture of this module. So, today's lecture is titled as Sensation Basic Processes. So, this is module that will talk about both the processes of sensation as well as perception, but in this lecture, today's lecture, the focus will be more or specifically on the basic ideas around the concept of sensation. So, before we talk about today's lecture, just to give you a brief recap of the last lecture, which was part of the module 2, and in module 2 we are discussing about the biological basis of behavior or some of the biological aspects which are connected to our psychological functionings. So, in the last lecture, which was lecture number 4, we discussed the concept of nature and nurture in terms of understanding behavior, what is the contribution of genetics or biological aspects particularly, and what is the contribution of environmental aspects in determining human behavior. More specifically, we discuss the role of genes in shaping personality, traits and behavior. We also discussed what are the direct and indirect genetic influences on behavior. Then we also discussed what are the possibilities that environmental influences can change the expression of genes or genetic effects. In that context, we also discussed the concept of epigenetics. So, these are some of the things that we discussed in the last lecture, which was about the biological basis of behavior. Today's lecture will be focusing on the concept of sensation and what are the sensory processes. We will talk about the psychophysics, which is the foundation of sensory processes. We will talk about the key concept in sensory functionings like threshold, signal detection theory, sensory adaptation and so on. We will also briefly touch upon the concept of subliminal perception, and at the end we will talk about some real world application of these ideas. So, let us start today's lecture. So, what is sensation? When we talk about sensation in psychology, we mean it very specifically. It is a process by which our sensory organs detect some physical stimuli from the environment. So, it is very simple process. Simple idea is when our sensory organs like eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin detect physical stimuli from the environment. So, our sense organ are primarily designed to detect different types of stimuli, So, eyes basically detects light, ears detect sound waves and so on. So, the basic idea of that whenever our sensory organs detect some physical stimuli like light, sound wave and so on from the environment. So, that the process of that detection is called sensation. So, it is a raw detection. So, whatever is coming from the environment, the sensory organs are just detecting it. So, there is no interpretation or mental processes involved in it in the stage of sensation. It is just raw detection of whatever environmental stimuli is coming that our sense organ detects them. So, this process of detection is sensation. So, the moment our sensory organs detects those stimuli, we call it as a sensation. So, what are the key characteristics of sensation? So, it is a very biological and automatic process. So, it is already inbuilt in our system. So, our sense organs, once they are functioning, whenever there is a stimuli from the environment, it will detect it. So, it is a very biological and automatic process. It involves raw data, not the meaning. So, here involvement of mind is not there directly, because it is just a detection of the whatever is coming from the environment without involvement of interpretation and so on, which is part of perception. In perception, there is an interpretation. So, it depends on sensory receptors. Obviously, whatever receptors are there in the sense organs, that will detect it. It precedes perception. So, sensation is the first step. After that, perception happens, which we will talk about later. So, for example, when you see colors or sound waves from the environment, that is a sensation. The moment you see colors or you detect whatever the visual stimuli coming to your sense organ without interpretation. So, that detection part is called sensation. So, that is what sensation means. It is a raw detection of environmental stimuli. Now, how this process of sensation happens? What are the steps involved in it? So, typically there are 3 steps involved in it. The first step is called stimulation. So, that is the stimulation part. What happens here? Physical energy from the environment stimulates sensory receptors. So, for example, light coming and it stimulates the sensory receptors in our eyes. So, that is the first is stimulate. So, our eyes or whatever the cells in the retina gets activated, because there is a light involved in it. So, it is detecting the light, our eyes. So, that is the stimulation part of it. The light enters the eye, sound waves enter the ear, odor molecules enter the noses. So, accordingly the different stimuli are detected by the different sense organs. So, the first part is our initially the sense organs or the receptors in those sense organs get stimulated. Okay. This is the first step. Second step is transduction. What happens here? It converts the physical energy into electrical neural impulses. So, the first physical energy comes like light energy, sound waves and so on. So, that is typical physical energy that is coming from the environment. Then they touches your sense organs or sensory receptors in those organs, and then these sensory receptors convert those physical energy into neural impulse. So, they converts the form of energy so that they can travel to the brain for further processing. So, each sensory system has specialized receptor cells. For example, retina of the eye converts light into neural signals, cochlea of the ear converts sound vibration into neural signals. Because if this is not converted into neural signals, it cannot be processed by the brain. So, the first step is stimulation, then there is a conversion of energy from physical energy to neural impulse, which is called as transduction. The last step is transmission. What happens here? Neural impulse, whatever got converted in the sense organs, travel through the sensory neurons to specific brain areas, and all these senses are connected to the brain. Okay. So, this neural impulse which got basically through the process of transduction, physical energy got converted into neural impulse, then this neural impulse travels from these sense organs to the specific parts of the brain where the processing happens, further processing happens. For example, we discussed in the last module the biological basis of behavior, that for visual stimuli whatever we see, it is processed in the occipital lobe. So, for hearing it is processed in the parietal lobe. So, different part of the brain processes specialized sensory inputs. So, this neural impulse travels to those appropriate places in the brain where the further processing happens and detection happens. So, this is the basic processes or step by step process of how sensation happens in our brain or through the body. So, this is a very raw physical automatic biological process. Although we are saying it is automatic, there is some other aspects involved, we will talk about that. At this stage in terms of definition, it is very raw and automatic process. So, just to give you an example, when we look at a beautiful sunset, light waves enters the eye, pass through the lens of the eye and reach to the retina. The retina contains photoreceptor cells that convert this light into electrical impulse or neural impulse, then it is sent to the brain. The raw data from this process is sensation. So, the brain then detects something is there, some light and some whatever, different colors are there. So, the detection, once it reaches to the brain, it detects that something is there. So, that is called the process of sensation. Similarly, for the sound waves reach the ear, vibrates the eardrum and stimulates tiny hair cells in the cochlea of the ear. These cells produce neural signals that the brain recognizes as sound, such as song or a bell. Okay. So, then the detection happens of the auditory impulse or auditory stimuli. So, like this whole process of sensation happens. So, sensation is a very physical process. It is about detecting and relaying this raw information to the brain. Whatever is there in the environment, it detects it through the sense organ, and the sense organ transfer this information to the brain where it detects, where the processing happens. Now, it is different from the concept of perception, which we will talk more detail in the upcoming lecture. When we say perception, it is the psychological interpretation of those signals. So, when there is a stimulation coming from the environment, raw detection is sensation, but once you then interpret what is this sensation is all about, on top of that, that is called perception. For example, the light wave coming to your ears, and then you see whatever is there in front of you, detect that there are some objects around it. But then you interpret this object as a face or as a table or as a chair, then this is an interpretation, that is called perception. So, it is in one step ahead of the sensation. From sensation, perception happens. For example, you see color and shapes, so that is the sensation, but then you recognize these colors and shape as someone's face. that is called perception. Now, you are interpreting these sensations as face. So, your mind is interpreting something on top of that. So, that is called perception. Now, one of the area of study which made major contribution in the area of sensation is something called as psychophysics. In fact, that is one of the also foundation of scientific research in psychology, that psychophysics, they scientifically studied a lot of these processes of sensations through experiments and so on. So, this psychophysics looks into this relationship between the physical stimuli and how it relates to psychological experiences. So, psychophysics is a branch of psychology that studies the relationship between physical stimuli, like what happens in the sensation. We have physical stimuli like light, sound. So, all this physical stimuli that is coming, and once it comes, how it translates into psychological experiences and the psychological experiences they produce. Once the stimuli comes, then how they, what kind of psychological experiences they produce. So, this relationship is studied in psychophysics. So, there is a physical part, there is a psychological part. They see the relationship between them. So, this is called the branch of study called psychophysics. So, in simple terms we can say it connects the outside world stimulus or energy with the inner world of sensation and perception. So, psychophysics looks into these dimensions of how physical stimuli is connected to psychological experiences. This branch was originated by Fechner, who has a very celebrated book called Elements of Psychophysics, which was published in 1960, and many people call it actually the real scientific beginning of psychology. Even it predates Wilhelm Wundt's 1879 laboratory of psychology, which is generally marked as the beginning of scientific psychology. Some says Fechner was a little ahead of that. Even before that he published that, and that could be also called as actually the real beginning of scientific psychology. But in record generally Wilhelm Wundt's establishment of first lab is considered generally 1879 as the beginning of scientific psychology. But Fechner's study actually predates little earlier than Wundt's establishment of laboratory. Anyways, so he has also contributed a lot in terms of how scientifically studying psychological experiences. So, what we study in psychophysics? In psychophysics, basically the basic idea is to understand how physical stimuli translate into psychological experiences. Okay? So, what are the methods involved in it? What kind of methods are used to study this relationship of physical stimuli and psychological experiences? So, there are three basic methods to study psychophysics. One is called as method of limits, second is called method of adjustment, and the third is called method of constant stimuli. So, let us see one by one what are these methods and how they are used to kind of study this relationship of physical stimuli and psychological experiences. First is called method of limits. What happens here? So, here the experimenter presents stimuli from weak to strong or vice versa. Generally, it is presented from weak to strong. So, certain stimuli, physical stimuli, let us say sound. So, that they will start some kind of sound which is very weak. So, it will start with something that cannot be detected, very low sound. Then slowly they will increase the volume to the extent that then they will try to find out what is the threshold of detection by the participants. So, once they increase slowly to when the first time the participant detects, okay, now I can hear this sound. So, they present stimuli from weak to strong or vice versa from strong to weak, mostly it is weak to strong, and ask the participants when they first notice that now I can notice this sound, first they notice or detects it. So, that is called method of limits. So, the experimenter presents stimuli with gradually changing intensity, either ascending or descending way, from undetectable to detectable or descending way the other way around. So, they will start, let us say, in an ascending way, start with the undetectable stimuli and then slowly they will increase, so that, and they will try to find out where is the threshold that a participants can detect those sound. For example, a researcher might gradually increase the volume of a tone or a sound until a participant raises their hand to indicate they can hear it. So, this point of the transition is called threshold estimate. So, that is where the threshold is. This is the minimum sound that can be detected by the participants. Now, obviously, then it is not just detecting one time, they use 50%, that at least 50% of the time that should be detected, because every time they may not detect and so on. So, we will look into that later. So, this is the method of limits, how these thresholds are detected by changing the intensity of the stimuli from weak to strong or strong to weak to till when the participants are able to detect it. So, this is called method of limits. Now, what happens in methods of adjustment? It is also very similar, but here the experimenter does not present. Here the participant they themselves adjust the stimuli so that they can detect it. So, it is given to the participant. Here the person or the participant adjusts the stimuli until it is detectable. So, this is a method of adjustment that allows the participant to control the stimulus intensity themselves, adjusting until it can be perceived. So, this is basically done by the participants, and in the case of method of limits, the experimenter slowly changes the intensity and then they ask participant when they can detect it. Here the participant they themselves adjust and they say, okay, this is the limit where we kind of detect it. Here the participant is given control of the stimulus intensity and adjust it until matches a certain level whatever is given, such as being just noticeable or matching a certain standard stimuli, whatever is asked by the experimenter. For example, a participant might turn a dial to gradually increase the tone's volume until they can just barely hear it. So, only difference here of method of limits and adjustment is that who controls changing the intensity. In the method of adjustment, it is done by the participant. In the method of limits, it is done by the experimenter. Now, this method has certain advantages and disadvantages. Method of adjustment. This method is much quicker because participant can themselves adjust it according to themselves. So, it takes less time as compared to method of limits, making it useful for participants with limited attention. So, participant with limited attention they can also do it for their own, but the problem is it can be less accurate. Why less accurate? Because here the participant they themselves are adjusting. So, there can be so many variability in terms of how they are doing it, you the data may not be fully reliable. So, because the participants control the stimulus themselves, individual differences. So, there are so many individual differences that can come into the picture, which can make adjustment, lot of variability can come into that. So, accuracy may decrease. The last method is called the method of constant stimuli. Now, what is that method? Here the experimenter again here presents, here participant is not given the control. Experimenter presents stimuli of varying intensity in a random order and record detection rates. Now, here there is no pattern, like it will not be like low to high or high to low, which was there in the earlier cases. In this case, all kinds of intensities of different intensities, sometimes high, low, moderate and so on, everything can be randomly presented, and the participants are asked to report when they can detect something. So, the method of this constant stimuli presents various stimulus intensity in a random unpredictable order, providing most accurate results by preventing prediction, because in other cases of method of limits and adjustment there is a predictable patterns. Things are now sound intensity is increasing, so participant can expect now, and accordingly they can sometimes based on expectation they can say something. So, there can be errors involved in it, but when it is random you do not know when high intensity, low intensity, moderate intensity is going to come. So, that expectancy part is removed, which reduces the errors. So, wide range of stimulus intensities is pre-selected by the researcher and then presented to the participant in a random order with no predictable patterns. So, this participant must indicate whether they can perceive the stimuli for each random presentation. So, every time this randomly these intensities are presented, they are asked whether you can detect it or not. Accordingly, they find out the threshold and so on. So, this method of constant stimuli is the most rigorous form of approach, okay, in terms of as a method, because the stimuli are presented randomly, participant cannot predict or anticipate what is coming, making it less biased, because they cannot now be biased. So, biasness is very less likely to happen here in this case, because they cannot predict anything. However, the problem with this approach is that this is the benefit is it is the most reliable method, but also it is the most time consuming method, because you have to present so many trials may be required to find out the correct kind of the threshold to detect and so on. So, So, although it may be very accurate, but it can be very time consuming. So, just to summarize these three methods, the method of limits, who controls the intensity? Experimenter. And what is the order of presentation? Gradually, high to low or low to high. Accuracy can be said moderate accuracy, okay, in terms of data accuracy and so on. Method of adjustment, here again here the control is given to the participants and order is also self controlled. Participant decide how they do it. There also it typically can be gradual from low to high or high to low, but the participant decides it. It is very fast, but less precise and less accurate. So, that is the one disadvantage of it. The last one is constant stimuli. Here the control is in the experimenter hands in terms of giving what intensity of stimuli. The order is very random and it is most accurate, but it can be most time consuming also. So, this is just summary of these three methods. Now, when we talk about sensory functionings or the study of sensation or study of psychophysics, these three concepts are very important, okay, in the field of psychophysics or the field of sensation. These three concepts are very important. To understand the concepts of sensation, we need to understand these three aspects. The first is the concept of threshold. We will talk about each of them. It is about, what is the minimum level of something, of a stimuli which can be detected. Okay. Then the concept of signal detection, how people detect something, some stimuli. Is it just about the physical stimuli or there are some other aspects involved in it? So, that is called signal detection. The third concept is called sensory adaptation, how people adapt to sensations that comes from the environment. So, these three concepts are very important in the field of sensation or the study of sensation or the field of psychophysics. So, now let us look into each of them more in an elaborate way. So, the first concept is called thresholds, sensory thresholds. Now, when we talk about our sensory thresholds, so we have 5 sense organs. They are all specialized for certain kind of stimuli to be detected. For example, eyes can detect light, ears can detect your sound waves and so on. Your skin can touch, can detect touch sensation and so on. So, every sense organs have certain specialized kind of capacity to detect certain type of information, but there are limits to these sensory organs also. They cannot just detect everything around it. So, our sense organ has limitations also. What is that limitation? A stimulus must be strong enough to be detected. Every stimuli that is there in the environment, we are not able to detect them. We are not able to detect every intensity of the sound. We are not able to detect every intensity of the light waves that are there in the environment. We are not able to detect. So, there are so many frequencies of those lights and sound waves. We are not able to detect everything. So, there has to be certain threshold, certain intensity of those stimuli to be there in the environment to be detected. So, those are called that minimum that intensity to be detected, that is called as threshold. Now, there are two main sensory thresholds that are studied in psychophysics. One is called as absolute threshold, another is called difference threshold. So, let us look into these two types of threshold that are very important. So, what is absolute threshold? So, absolute threshold in a very simple sense means it is the minimum level of a stimulus that a person can detect for any stimuli. So, it may be light, it can be sound, it can be touch, whatever it is. What is the minimum intensity of it that a person can detect it? So, that is called absolute threshold of any stimuli. Now, here there is an additional criteria which is used for this detection thing is 50% of the time, because a person may not be able to detect every time it is presented. So, if they are able to detect at least 50% of the time, then we can say this is the minimum threshold. So, in other words, it is the lowest strength of a signal or a stimuli that our sense can pick up reliably. What is the minimum of that sound? What is the minimum of that light that we can detect? So, this lowest strength of signal or stimuli that our sense organs can detect is called as absolute threshold, but that should be detected at least 50% of the time when presented again and again. Why this 50% time? Just to make it more reliable. Human sensitivity varies from moment to moment, because every time our sensitivity of sense organs are not equal. Sometimes same stimulus I can detect and another time I may not be able to detect. So, if I am able to detect at least 50%, half of the time, if I present it let us say 10 times, I am able to detect 5 times, then it is okay. So, that is the basic minimum criteria. So, sometimes you may notice a faint sound, sometimes not, because depending on certain other factors like your psychological readiness and so on and so on. So, to make it scientific and consistent, researchers set this standard. If you can detect it half of the time, it counts as your threshold. So, that is why 50% criteria is used. So, simply put, the absolute threshold is like the starting point of our senses. What is the starting point of our senses? That this is the starting of intensity your sense organs can detect. It is the smallest amount of light, sound, smell, taste, touch we need before we can say yes, I notice it. This is the minimum of that is called absolute threshold. For every sense organ there can be certain absolute threshold. For example, these are some of the examples that were established by the experiments. For vision, for seeing, what is the minimum or what is the absolute threshold? For a lot of participants that they found is that a flame from a single candle flickering about 30 miles away from on a dark clear night. So, researcher found that is the absolute threshold for vision. Flame from a single candle which is flickering about 30 miles away in a dark clear night. That is the minimum most of the people can detect it. These are some of the things that were established by the experiment. For hearing, for example, the ticking of a watch placed about 20 feet away from a listener in a quiet room. So, participant can detect the minimum is the ticking of a watch placed about 20 feet away from a listener in a quiet room. They are able to detect it. So, like this, so for different sense organs there are some absolute threshold that were established by the research. For taste, for example, they have given about 1 teaspoon of sugar dissolved in a 2 gallons of water. For smell, about 1 drop of perfume dispersed in a small house and so on, like this. So, there can be different absolute threshold for different sense organs. So, this is absolute threshold. Now, comes the difference threshold. What is difference threshold? It is also known as just noticeable difference, JND. So, difference, what is the difference, minimum difference from one intensity to another intensity, how much change is required to detect the difference. Here it is absolute was detecting, just detecting the minimum of that stimuli, minimum intensity that is required to be detected. Here minimum intensity of difference between two intensities. So, it is the smallest difference between two stimuli that a person can detect 50% of the time. Again 50% criteria is used here, because people may not sometimes detect, sometimes not able to detect because of maybe they are not attentive enough or so on. So, what is the difference between two stimuli? Let us say sound, one intensity of sound and another intensity of sound. Is the person is able to detect this difference between these two, or I need to increase the sound little bit more to detect the difference, that this sound is little higher than this sound. What is that minimum difference that is required is difference threshold. So, it is the minimum change in a stimulus you can notice. Some examples, for example, for weight, holding a 100-gram chocolate bar, if another 2 gram is added, you may not notice any change in the weight. So, let us say you are having a 100-gram chocolate bar, you are taking it on your hand. If I add 2 more gram of weight, you may not notice any change in the weight. But let us say I add 10 gram more on that chocolate, now probably you will sense the difference, now the weight has increased. 2 gram may not lead to that noticing of differences, but if 10 gram is added, probably the people will notice now the weight is more than the earlier. So, I can say this 10 gram may be the minimum. If it is the minimum weight that is required to understand this difference or detect this difference, then it will become 10 gram weight will become the difference threshold. So, in a simpler term, just noticeable difference or difference threshold is the smallest weight difference you can feel, weight difference that you can feel. For example, for sound, we can say if a music is playing at a low volume, increasing it just a little may not be noticeable. If at a certain intensity you are playing a music, little bit of increase one may not notice ki now the sound has increased. Let us say it is in a very low volume, little bit of increase one can detect now the volume has increased. Now, let us say already the volume is very high, a small increase people may not notice it. So, like this, so for difference threshold can also be calculated for different stimuli and so on. Now, there is a law in that. So, there is a pattern in the difference threshold that is noticed, which is kind of formalized in terms of Weber's law, because it was proposed by Ernst Weber. This law says this is about just noticeable difference or difference threshold. Weber law says that size of the difference threshold or just noticeable difference is not fixed. It is not that, for example, for weight, if I add 10 gram, for every type, for every weight, if I add 10 gram, this is not the truth. So, there is some kind of pattern in it, is that, so this is not fixed, but depends on the proportion of the change to the original stimulus. It depends on the what is the original stimulus, intensity of the original stimulus. So, if the original stimulus changes, what is the amount of further changes required will also differ, will also change. So, it is not fixed. So, there is a constant proportion that has to be, that depends on the original intensity of the stimuli, you know. So, Weber law says this proportion is size of the just noticeable difference or difference threshold is proportional to the initial stimulus. So, if the initial stimulus is very high, the further intensity that needs to be changed will also become higher. So, it is proportional to the original stimulus. So, this is called Weber fraction. So, this is difference threshold or just noticeable difference, this is the original stimuli and this is the proportion. So, that a fraction that comes out. So, this is the formula. For example, how do I understand this? For example, Weber constant for weight is, let us say 1 by 50. So, if say, see this is the formula, okay. For example, you know, so let us say we need for 50 pound, we need 1 pound. So, that difference threshold is 1 pound, original is 50 pound or 50 kg, let us say. So, the fraction is somewhere 0.02. If you convert it into percentage or multiply it by 100, then it will become 2%. So, what does that mean? That means, if I add 1 gram to 50 gram, let us say through experiment I find it, the difference threshold for 50 kg weight or for weight is, let us say, the proportion is like for 50 kg I need 1 kg to be added to understand the difference. Then the proportion is 0.02 or if you convert it into percentage, it is 2%. So, then this proportion of 2% will be based on what is the intensity of the original. So, the more if the intensity changes for original stimuli, the weight will also change for noticeable difference. So, for 50 pound here, let us say or 50 kg, whatever we say, we need 1 pound change to be noticed. Let us say this is the fraction that we have found. Now, let us say the weight changes to 200 pound. So, accordingly, from this formula we can say we need 4 pound change to notice it. So, that is a constant proportion. For 50 kg or 50 pound, 1 pound change is required for difference threshold. For 200 it will be 4 pound. So, proportional. For 51, 102, 204. So, from that formula we can detect what is the minimum noticeable change that is required. For example, here for difference threshold we can find out, for difference threshold I could be k into I. So, k is the fraction. So, if the fraction is 0.02 and original is, let us say, here we are calculating what is the original for 200. So, accordingly it will be whatever that is coming for that will be 4. So, it will be 4 kg. So, difference threshold we can calculate for every intensity of the action. So, for 50 it is 1, let us say we have already established. For any further kind of intensities we can calculate the difference threshold accordingly using this formula. What more? So, for 200 kg or 200 pound, let us say we need to add 4 more kg. If we keep increasing that intensity that is required to be added for noticing the change will also keep rising if we increase the original stimulus, and it will keep decreasing if we decrease the original stimulus. So, there is a constant proportion to it. So, it is not fixed. So, that is what Weber law talks about. So, there is a proportion is same, 2% increase is needed. So, it is proportional to the original stimulus. So, in that sense, as the original stimulus changes, so the amount of intensity to be added will also change, but the proportion will remain same. So, every time 2% increase, 2% increase, 2% of the original. So, or if original changes, the 2% weight will also change, but 2% will remain constant. So, that is called Weber law. For sound wave also similar thing we can calculate. Now comes the second important concept in psychophysics, which is called as signal detection theory. So, in the absolute threshold and difference threshold or sensory threshold, the concept was very simple. How your sense organ detects something, it is just about detection. In signal detection is theory, so this detection is in the threshold concept, we are just detecting when your sense organ can detect something. In signal detection, it says the detection is not just about the intensity, which was basically the assumptions in the sensory threshold. Now, this detection of the stimuli is not just based on what is the intensity of a certain stimuli. Sometimes it also depends on other factors. Signal detection talks about other factors. So, it says, so the threshold of detecting any signal or stimuli depends not only on the stimulus itself, such as only in the intensity or loudness of a sound, but also the level of background stimulation. What is the background stimulation? Noise, is there any noise? These are also important. Or the biological and psychological characteristics of the persons, whether his sense organs are functioning properly or not, psychological attention is there or not. All these factors will also involve in the detection. So, signal detection theory adds nuances to the detection process. So, this threshold detection depends not only on the intensity of the sound, but also obviously the stimulus properties, it depends on intensity also is very important, but it also depends on the background stimulation. What is there any noise in the background or not, that will also influence the detection. Biological and psychological characteristics of the perceiver, whether his sense organs are functioning properly, whether he is attentive to notice or not. If he is absent minded, obviously he will not be able to detect. So, all these other factors could add into the process of detection. So, signal detection says we need to focus on other factors also. So, biological factor means what kind of biological factors can influence the detection, like your sensitivity of the sensory system, sharpness of the eyesight, hearing, physical condition, duller sense of smell when you have a cold. Let us say you are not well or sick, then obviously if you have a cold you will not be able to detect the smell. Fatigue or alertness level, whether you are fatigued, tired, if you are alertness level different, then obviously detection will also be influenced. Psychological factors includes things like what is your attention level. If you are not attentive, you will not be even notice high intensity stimulation also. Certain motivational factors will also influence detection. For example, if somebody is hungry, they are more likely to notice food aromas, because the biology is kind of propelling them to notice it, or psychologically they are hungry because that hunger will propel them to detect those things which can fulfill their hunger. If somebody has fear, more likely to notice faint sound even walking alone, because they are fearful. Even faintest of the sound they may notice it. Same faint sound may go unnoticed in daylight and so on, but in night you may notice it because you are fearful, your alertness is more. So, these are all different factors which can contribute to the detection, not just the intensity of the stimulus or signal. Now, the signal detection says there are 4 possible outcomes in the concept of signal detection. What are these four possible outcomes? Let us say when signal is present, means a stimulus is actually present in the environment, and you say yes, I can notice it, then it is called hit. It is present and you are correctly reporting it that it is present, then it is called hit. This is one outcome. Second outcome is signal is present, but you are saying no, you are not able to detect it. It is actually there, but you are saying I cannot detect it for whatever reason. Then it is called miss. So, there is that your report is not actually correct, signal is present, but you are saying I cannot detect it. Let us say that it is above the threshold, then it is miss. Third possibility is that signal is absent and you are saying yes, something is not there and you are saying it is there. So, this is called false alarm. Sometimes people report such kind of things. Some sound is not there, they will say I heard this sound. So, this is called false alarm. The fourth option is signal absent, you say no, this is correct rejection. Signal is not there, you say it is not there. Again this is just like hit, but in a opposite sense. So, this is called correct rejection. So, these are the 4 possibilities. Just to give some example, hit is when, let us say there is a faint sound of siren while you are driving with music on. So, hit case will be what? When siren is present, Let us say siren is there and you notice, and whatever action needs to be done, you are doing it. Then it is hit. Miss, siren is present, but you are not able to hear it due to some other background noise of music and so on. False alarm, you think you are heard about some siren, but it was not there. Some other similar sound was there. So, this is false alarm. Correct rejection, there was no siren in the road, but and you also do not react. So, you also do not report or some kind of detect it. So, these are 4 possibilities in terms of signal detection according to the theory of signal detection. The third important concept in the psychophysics or in the concept of sensation is sensory adaptation. Now, sensory adaptation is, what is this adaptation happens in the sensory context? The gradual decrease in sensitivity to a constant or unchanging stimuli. Whenever there is a constant stimuli is going on and on, for example, some sound in the background is going on and on. So, there is a constantly it is maintained. Then slowly our sensitivity to that stimulus decreases if it is a constant thing. Initially you will be disturbed, then after sometimes you stop noticing it even though it is there. So, this is called adaptation, we adapt to it. So, our sensory systems are designed to detect changes in the environment. Whenever there is a change, our system should detect it, because that is important. If something is not changing and it is constant, then slowly our sensory system stop noticing it. So, in simple words, when a stimulus stays constant, your senses simply tunes out of it, simply because it stop detecting it, because that is no longer required to be detected, because it is constantly there. Why does this happen? It happens, it is a kind of adaptive function. It happens to free up attention and energy to detect new changes. For example, if your all attention is there something which is constantly going on, you will not be able to notice any further new changes in the environment, which is not good, because then new changes are also important. If something is constant, you already paid attention. Now, how long you need to pay attention, because it is already you have paid attention. Now, if further new changes happen, you need to detect that, because that can be more important. So, this sensory adaptation frees up attention and energy for detecting new potentially important stimuli. If our brain paid equal attention to every constant sensation, then we will be overloaded, we will not be able to process lot of new information. So, adaptation help us to focus on what is changing or what is important in the environment. So, that is why it is very important also. So, our sense also kind of, it is not that every time it will detect everything in the same way. If something is very constantly going on in the background, you stop noticing it. This happens, a lot of people like who stays near a railway line, initially when they stays there, the sound of the railway will disturbs them a lot. But let us say after 4 or 5 days, they do not even notice any sound from the railway station, because they just get adapted, the sensory system gets adapted to it, no longer pays attention to it, it no longer disturbs them. Initially 4 or 5 days they cannot sleep, because every sound from the railway will disturb them, but then slowly they get adapted to it. Then after some days they do not even notice any sound, they cannot even say okay, railway sound are there. So, this is an example of sensory adaptation. So, everyday examples, there are so many examples of sensory adaptation. For example, in case of touch pressure, wearing a watch, ring or glasses, initially you feel it first, but after some times you stop noticing it. First time, let us say you are wearing some watch or ring or glasses, when you initially use it, you feel it. After sometimes you do not even notice it, that you have a glass or you have a watch and so on. Sitting on a chair, initially you notice the pressure, then you forget about it. Similarly, for the smell, you enter a locker room or a bakery, strong smell at first, but soon you do not notice it. So, this is why others may notice your perfume even when you do not smell it, because you get adapted to it. So, temperature also similarly, you jump into a cold swimming pool, feels freezing at first, but after few minutes you will feel comfortable. So, your body, your skin get adapted to the temperature. So, these are all examples of sensory adaptations. Now, in certain cases sensory adaptation may not happen in some specialized circumstances, when there is a very strong or dangerous stimuli going on in your surrounding, then adaptation may not happen, especially if that sound is a signal of threat. For example, a loud car alarm keeps grabbing attention even after repeated exposure. let us say it's a loud car alarm is going on. So, that means this is some kind of danger is there. It may still grab your attention even though it is constantly going on and on, because there is some kind of danger is there. A smell of smoke does not fade, since it may signal a danger. Even though it may be there for some times, you still notice it and may pay attention because you think there is some kind of danger is there. So, sometimes sensory adaptation may not happen, particularly when the signal that is coming may be a signal of danger. So, sensory adaptation has so many advantages. As we said, without sensory adaptation we will be overloaded, and we cannot pay attention to constant things all the time. So, it prevents sensory overload, allows focus on new and changing stimuli, it helps us to survive, keeps us alert to potential dangers while ignoring irrelevant background sensations. If something is constantly there and it is not relevant, then what is the point of spending energy in that? So, your system automatically looks into other factors. So, it helps you to survive in day to day life and so on. Now, there is another concept called subliminal perception, although it is written perception, but it has something to do with detection. Some research says that people can sometimes detect or certain stimuli which is below threshold. As we said, absolute threshold, any stimuli above absolute threshold can be detected by us, but sometimes even below threshold some lot of stimuli can be unconsciously detected and may have some influence. So, that is called as subliminal perception. So, subliminal perception involves detecting stimuli below the threshold or conscious awareness. So, consciously you are not able to detect it, but unconsciously your system may detect it, such as some faint sound, odor or rapidly flashed images, very rapidly flashed images which you may not even see that something was there. You came and gone very rapidly, can evoke some brain responses. So, this is what subliminal perception means. You are perceiving something which is below the threshold, or at least it is having some impact on you. Some claims were very exaggerated initially, like in 1957 James Vicary claimed sales increased by flashing eat popcorn, drink coke subliminally in some theaters or something like that. These people were not even aware, but this advertisement were flashed very fast. People were not even able to consciously say these things were there, and the person claimed that such flashing of advertisement could increase the sales and so on. However, control tests failed to replicate such results. Vicary later admitted it was not correct, it was a hoax kind of thing. So, myth persists in advertising and many public belief about subliminal perception. Sometimes people claim exaggerate things about subliminal perceptions. A lot of this may not be correct, but some of the things may be correct. Like research shows, subliminal self-help products, subliminally advertising do not produce meaningful behavior changes, but some changes could be there. It may not be very meaningful change that happens because of subliminal perception. However, subliminal stimuli can have limited effects, very limited effects. For example, the mere exposure effect, increased liking of a repeatedly presented stimuli also applies to subliminal presentation. When you repeatedly present something, even if it is subliminally presented, you may start liking it. This is what advertisement is all about. You are showing same thing again and again and again, everywhere you see some product and somebody endorsing it again and again. Slowly people may start liking it. And research shows that this exposure effect can be even true when presented subliminally, even though you may not be consciously detecting it, but something unconsciously may influence and you start liking something when it is presented again and again. So, this is something called as a mere exposure effect. Subliminal influence is most effective when aligned with existing goals. For example, participants subliminally exposed to Lipton 1 preferred it over other brands. So, when subliminally this Lipton 1 is a brand which is basically tea makers or some drinks, when this brand was presented again and again subliminally, participant actually preferred this brand over other brands, even though they were not consciously detecting those presentation. So, there can be some liking may be influenced by such presentation. Subliminal cues can also affect some attitudes and some emotions. Exposure to subliminally fearful faces lead participant to rate subsequent faces as more unpleasant. So, when subliminally certain fearful faces were presented first, subliminally means they were not consciously could remember that something was presented like this, but very first some flashes of fearful faces were presented first and then some other faces were presented. But when the researcher found when these fearful faces were preceded before the other faces, their liking for the other faces which was actually presented above threshold, they could detect it, their liking actually decreased when they were presented. Before this, the presentation was some fearful faces. So, exposure to subliminal fearful faces led participant to rate when they are asked to rate certain faces, simply because it was preceded with some fearful faces which they were not even conscious of. They rated those faces more unpleasant or kind of some more negative rating was there. Subliminal odors influence likability rating of faces. Some odors like what kind of smells, pleasant scents increases ratings while unpleasant scent decrease them, but only when participants were unaware of such odors. When they are not really, but subliminally such odors were there, then probably their rating was influenced. If they notices the scent, then obviously some other higher cognitive processes came into the picture which may not fully influenced it. So, subliminally presented certain visual stimuli or certain odors, certain sounds could influence some aspects of our attitudes and emotions. That kind of evidences are there. So, subliminal stimuli can temporarily influence some of these attitudes and emotions, yet these effects are brief and may be weaker than exaggerated claims. So, these effects may be very weak and for a brief time, it may not be a very meaningful change because of the subliminal perception. So, lot of these exaggerated claims that people can be their attitudes can be fully changed and lot of these sales could be increased and so on, probably these are lot of exaggerated things. Certain changes could be there, but profound and lasting behavioral and personality changes may not happen. So, this is another area. Okay. Now, let us see some of the possible applications of these principles of sensation in the real world. So, there is something called as a sensory marketing, which is used in the consumer behavior and the advertisement world, which uses this idea of sensation and lot of these principles that we discussed. So, consumer decisions are strongly influenced by sensory inputs. What products to buy, what products not to buy, whether they like some products. Many times, lot of this sensory information influences that. Sensory signals influences those buying behaviors, consumer behaviors. Marketers use sight, sound, smell, touch, taste to kind of influence people's decisions to buy a product or overall consumer behavior. A lot of this sensory stimulation affects the attention of the people, emotion of the people, memory of the people, buying behavior of the people. What kind of sensory stimulation is given by a certain product, how it influences your senses. That has a very important influence on whether people will pay attention to it, whether people will be emotionally connect to it or whether people will buy that product or not. For example, how some people use visual sensation in their marketing, how it influences decisions. Visual information affects first impression of the product, brand recognition, perceived quality of the product is also influenced by how it is presented as a package. For example, red colors are used in the sale sign. If you see any kind of sale sign, mostly they will use very strong red color, so that it catches attention of the people. It creates a sense of urgency when very strong red colors are presented. It creates a sense of urgency and impulsive buying. People will get attention will be there in that hoardings or whatever product information is there. So, people use this kind of sensory stimulation, red color, very strong color for catching attention, and it creates an urgency and impulse buying, and automatically it influences your emotions. Sometimes people use minimalist packaging, like a very clean design, black and white colors. It can sometimes signals luxury. A lot of this luxury product, if you see their packaging, they are very simple, minimalist packaging, clean design, black and white color, So, sometimes it reflects, it stimulates sense of luxury, too much of color and too much of combination may not give this sense of luxury and so on. Online shopping, lot of these apps use bright product images to attract clicks. So, if you see lot of these products, when they are presented, the photo of the product in the apps may look very bright and very good, but when you actually buy that product, it comes to your home, you see it is different, because those photos were taken with full bright and colorful and so on. The actual color and the brightness may not be there when you actually take that product, but you will buy it because of that attractiveness of the photo and so on. So, they all use this kind of sensory information, the knowledge of the sensation in terms of changing the buying behavior of the people. For example, these are some of the examples, how simple packaging could evoke the sense of luxury, and how this red color attracts attention and people pay attention to that. So, this is how the people uses this information. Sometimes a lot of his advertisement also use sound as a kind of use sensation of sound to influence people's mind and emotions. So, for example, sound can influence your mood regulation, emotions, time spent in a store, brand recall value and so on. Everything can be influenced by certain sounds. For example, soft slow music in the malls make customers stay longer. So, when this soft calming music is played in the malls, lot of these malls played that, it was found that people actually stay more because of some of the influence of this music and so on. Fast music in fast food outlets increases quick turnover. When sometimes fast musics are there, the people immediately go and then someone else will come, and that fastness also, because that is required in certain fast food outlets, because you cannot, if you stay there for a long time, other customer will not find place and so on. Brand jingles helps consumers remember product easily. So, many brands uses particular jingles, small musical line and so on, and if they catches people attention, then people recall value of the brand increases, and they keep playing those jingles in every advertisement everywhere and so on. So, you will remember, okay, this is that product, and you are more likely to buy them and so on. So, these are some of the applications of how sensations, information of sensory information, the knowledge from the sensation are used in the real life, and this was just an example. So, with this I stop here. The next lecture will talk more about perception, next 2 lectures. So, with this I stop here. Thank you.